A miracle, a German blunder, and a disastrous defeat turned small victory. As requested, here is the story of the Battle of Dunkirk. The Battle of Dunkirk, or perhaps more appropriately known as the Evacuation of Dunkirk, took place in May of 1940 as the seemingly unstoppable Nazi German war machine invaded the Low Countries and northern France. The German advance on the Netherlands began on May 10th. The Dutch defenders were no match for the Nazi war machine. By May 13th, Queen Wilhelmina and her government had evacuated her country for England. The next day, on May 14th, the Dutch army surrendered to the Nazis. The Germans also invaded Belgium on May 10th. By May 11th, they had broken the lines of Belgium and advanced westward. The Allied front, comprised of French, British, and Belgian forces, fell back towards Antwerp. All the while, the German Luftwaffe was destroying most of the ports that offered any means of escape for the Allied forces against the advancing German war machine. The Allied forces retreated to the port town of Dunkirk, France, with the hopes of evacuating perhaps as many as 28,000 of the remaining 400,000 troops that were still in France. With the help of French and Belgian forces, the British Expeditionary Forces, led by General Lord Gort, prepared a perimeter around Dunkirk and prepared to evacuate. Designated Operation Dynamo, the initial plan called for the evacuation of troops by any means necessary, including destroyers and merchant ships. Supplementing these vessels were so-called little ships, basically consisting of anything that could float and carry troops away from northern France. Initially, the best hopes for Operation Dynamo were to evacuate 45,000 troops over 2 days. It was believed that the Germans would force the abandonment of evacuation efforts after the first 48 hours of the attempt. Operation Dynamo commenced on May 27th. During the first day, 7,699 troops were evacuated from Dunkirk. On the second day, 17,804 troops were evacuated. Operation Dynamo commenced on May 27th. During the first day, 7,699 troops were evacuated from Dunkirk. On the second day, 17,804 troops were evacuated. On June 1st, the British rearguard evacuated Dunkirk despite heavy Luftwaffe attacks. With the Germans only 3 miles away from Dunkirk, the final Allied vessel, the HMS Sakari, departed from Dunkirk on June 4th. The French troops that stayed behind to defend what was left of the perimeter were eventually forced to surrender to the Germans. At final count, 332,226 men were rescued from Dunkirk in what was called a miraculous victory. However, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was quick to point out the wars were not won by evacuations, and the Allied forces had a long way to go if they ever hoped to stop the German war machine. So how was this miraculous evacuation possible? Certainly, the bravery, strength, resourcefulness, and persistent efforts of the Allied forces cannot be overlooked or go unappreciated. However, a lot of credit also needs to be given to Adolf Hitler. On May 24th, Hitler gave the order to halt the advance toward Dunkirk, in the hopes that the British would be easier to convince to surrender and capitulate to his demands if they were not forced to bear the shame of further military defeat. Hitler lifted this order 3 days later, but by that time the defenses were strengthened and the Germans had a much harder time advancing, giving the Allied forces the time that they needed to cross the Channel. Though the evacuation of Dunkirk turned out much better than it might have been, the British Expeditionary Forces were forced to leave behind the vast majority of their heavy equipment, including tanks and artillery, leaving the British Isles a very difficult place to defend. However, that's a story for another video. This has been a brief telling of the battle and evacuation of Dunkirk. Many volumes of books can be and have been written about this pivotal point in world history, but I hope this gives you a good overview of the battle. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave me a comment. I'd also like to send a shout out to Richard Park, who suggested this video. Thanks for watching.